The queen was still breathing when the birds began to sing. They sang not for joy, but for memory, the kind that stains rather than heals. Their wings sliced the fog that clung to the tower, a fog thick with secrets and prayers that had never reached heaven. The stones, damp with centuries, did not blink as her bare feet touched them. There was no trumpet, no courtier, no velvet curtain, only the sound of skin against wood, and the soft gasp of a woman learning the shape of her end. Anne Boleyn was once crowned in gold and crimson, eyes raised beneath a canopy of roses. Now, she wore nothing but breath and bone, a body stripped not by poverty but by betrayal. Her crown was gone, but something darker gleamed in its place, a silence more radiant than any jewel. For silence does not plead, it watches, it remembers. She had given England a daughter and 1,000 nightmares. She had given Henry a mirror, and he had shattered it. There is no poetry in execution, yet the blade remembers what men try to forget. It drinks with a devotion no priest can match. Anne's name, whispered in linen chambers and on bloodied sheets, had become a shadow that crept too close to the throne. So they turned her name into an omen. They tore it from her lips and dressed it in treason. Yet even now, even as the axe waited in the hands of a foreign ghost, she stood straight. She did not beg. She did not scream. She did not curse the name of the king who had once sworn to die for her eyes. Because Anne Boleyn was not made of forgiveness, she was made of glass and fire too bright for the cathedral, too sharp for the crown. And when she finally fell, it was not her blood they feared. It was the silence that followed, a silence that still walks the tower, waiting, watching, breathing. She was not born beneath the stars, but she walked as if they bowed to her. Anne Boleyn, daughter of ambition and whisper, carried within her a darkness too poised to be named. From childhood, she had been taught not to speak, but to suggest, not to strike, but to wound with a glance. The courts of Burgundy and France had polished her edges with foreign light, but the chill that grew within her belonged solely to England. There was an elegance to her cruelty, a grace in her defiance. Her words could undress the soul without ever raising her voice. She moved through chambers like smoke moves through broken windows, uninvited, uncontainable. The women envied her poise, the men feared her mind. Her enemies did not speak of her intelligence, only of her eyes dark, quick, and knowing eyes that did not ask for love, only surrender. Henry had been a king, but when he looked into Anne's eyes, he became a man undone. His throne was a crucifix, and she was the temptation that refused to kneel. The court that surrounded her was a theater of pearls and wrought. Behind every embroidered curtain stood a sharpened smile. Silk rustled like serpents in the hallways. The air was perfumed with violets and venom. Power wore a gown, and gossip was scripture. There was no loyalty, only leverage. No truth, only timing. Anne did not merely enter this world, she rearranged it. She walked among the relics of Catherine of Aragon's sorrow, stepping over prayers that had dried into dust. The old queen's silence became Anne's music, and each step she took toward the throne was a step away from mercy. But Anne did not seek mercy. She sought meaning. She sought a crown, not to wear, but to unravel. She saw in Henry not a god, but a vessel of hunger. And she fed it with wit, with absence, with laughter held just beyond reach. She gave him the illusion of conquest, then withdrew. Her body was not a gift, but a prophecy. One Henry could not read without destroying the parchment. The moment she was crowned, the air in the abbey trembled. The archbishop anointed her with oil, but it was the people's silence that anointed her with doubt. No common prayer rose for her. No hand waved in devotion. The old blood of the realm curdled in protest. Yet Anne stood as though the silence were applause. She knew that reverence was too tame to last. It was fear that endured, and she made herself unforgettable not with sweetness, but with sharpness. Her voice carried in a council. Her opinions disturbed the still waters of the privy chamber. She touched matters of state with fingers too slender for war, yet too cunning for peace. She defended reform, mocked the monks, and wrote letters to Europe in a hand more dangerous than any sword. She had no army, no noble birthright, but she understood the nature of power, that it moves through desire, not decree. Henry had loved her like a storm loves the sea, violently, irrationally, seeking always to conquer what cannot be held. He broke his nation, his church, and his soul to taste her. He abandoned Rome, reshaped the sacred, and wore excommunication like a badge. But love, when starved of control, festers. And Anne, ever unpredictable, did not soften with the crown. She became sharper, more radiant, more disobedient. She laughed too freely, advised too boldly, and bore a daughter instead of a savior. Elizabeth, too red, too small, too female, had been born under omens, the midwives whispered, and Henry turned his face to the wall. He had risked eternity for a lineage, but the lineage refused to wear a son's face. Anne did not weep. She held the infant as though holding defiance itself. Yet the court felt the tremble. The king's gaze grew distant. The throne grew cold. Within the walls of Whitehall, rumors began to bloom like bruises. Anne is barren. Anne is cursed. Anne is unnatural. Her laughter became dangerous. Her wit, once prized, became insolent. The same voice that once thrilled the king now grated like broken bells. She argued theology. She interrupted. She questioned. And in the shadows of her chambers, Henry began to watch her not as a lover, but as a liability. The courtiers sensed the shift. Jane Seymour, pale and pliant, appeared like a sigh in the garden. Anne noticed. She always noticed. Her smiles became rehearsed. Her sleep turned shallow. She dreamt of wolves in the nursery, of blood on the cradle, of eyes watching her from within the fire. Even the birds changed their tune. The ravens circled closer to the chapel roof. Her allies turned to stone. Thomas Cromwell, once her instrument, now tightened the strings around her name. He had seen her rise and had learned from it. Power was not to be shared. It was to be devoured. And Anne, with her unpredictable glory, had become a mirror too sharp for the kingdom's fragile skin. She had dared to walk alone, dared to think without permission, dared to love a king without fearing him. That was her first mistake. That was her final sin. The court, once intoxicated by her flame, now awaited her extinguishing. The women watched her falter with silent satisfaction. The men spoke her name with caution, like a prayer turned curse. The poets who had once praised her beauty now spoke of witchcraft and charms. She was accused of sorcery, of adultery, of incest, not because it was believed, but because it was needed. The truth was irrelevant. The accusation was the art. The tower door did not creak when it opened. It sighed. She was taken not with violence, but with quiet ceremony. Her gowns removed, her jewels counted, her servants dismissed, her body catalogued like property, her breath measured like a ticking clock. The cell was not dark, but it was not light. It breathed with a stillness that mimicked the grave. The walls were close, damp, and unlistening. She did not scream. She did not cry. She touched the stone as one might touch the skin of an old friend. Her prayer was not for salvation, but for clarity, not to be spared, but to be seen. She wrote letters in her mind she would never send. She heard footsteps outside her chamber and did not flinch. She remembered the feel of the crown, the heaviness of it, the way it bruised the scalp beneath the velvet. She remembered Henry's kiss, not the warmth, but the calculation. the weighing of lips against legacy. When they brought her to trial, she did not break. The men who judged her wore her favors once pinned to their cloaks. They read from scrolls as if reading scripture, their eyes refusing to meet hers. She stood in crimson. She looked into the eyes of England's lords and saw not anger, but fear, the fear of what cannot be controlled, cannot be silenced, cannot be undone. Her voice, when she spoke, was neither pleading nor proud. It was precise, cold, pure. She did not defend herself with innocence. She defended herself with memory, and that, more than guilt, condemned her. The room could not contain the discomfort of her calm. It seeped into the floorboards, into the portraits, into the velvet seats of every witness. When the verdict was spoken, the court exhaled. A burden had been named, a silence assigned to death. The queen, the whore, the witch, all of them, one and the same. Anne lowered her eyes, not in shame, but in farewell. She knew already how the story would be written. Not as it was, but as it was needed. She was to be erased, yet made eternal in the erasing. The ink would dry where the blood began. And so she returned to the tower, not as a guest, but as an offering. The betrayal did not arrive in thunder, but in footsteps, soft and practiced, echoing through corridors too old to care. It came not with swords, but with whispers, parchment, and glances exchanged over goblets of wine. Anne Boleyn's ruin was not crafted in rage, but in stillness, the kind of stillness that waits for a breath to stop before entering the room. Thomas Cromwell, architect of reform and now engineer of ruin, began the unmaking not with fire, but with the delicate precision of a man sharpening a blade beneath his robes. He moved through the court like fog through a garden, leaving petals torn and roots poisoned. She had once been his ally, a queen of thorns who trampled monks and spilled sacred cows. But now she was a liability, a flickering torch threatening to set the scaffolding ablaze. And Cromwell, servant of silence, knew how to extinguish flames with dignity. He summoned the dead before they were corpses. He found treason in laughter, sedition in glances, damnation in every man who had once dared to dance near the queen. The charges were inked with care: adultery, incest, conspiracy. It did not matter if the truth lay elsewhere, for truth is merely a dog that does not bite when summoned. What mattered was timing. What mattered was obedience. And obedience meant watching the queen be carved from the story like rot from fruit. Her brother, George Boleyn, was among the first offered to the altar. A poet, a peacock, too clever for his lineage. He had once read Ovid aloud to the queen beneath the birch trees of Greenwich, his voice dancing between mockery and devotion. That moment, like all moments, had been watched. And now, in the echo of accusation, it was enough to condemn. He was stripped of his verse and dressed in shame, dragged before a court that demanded no evidence, only silence between words. Anne's other alleged lovers, Norris, Weston, Brereton, Smeaton, each caught in a net not of their own weaving, but of proximity. They had touched her hand, had laughed too freely, had lingered too long near her shadow. One confessed beneath torture, the others beneath the weight of inevitability. Their deaths were scheduled before their trials. Their names were unmade before they were read aloud. And still, within her chamber, Anne sat unblinking. She received the list of the accused like one receives a dream half believed, wholly dreaded. She did not weep. She asked for music. She asked for her books. She whispered prayers into the pillows that no longer held scent. Her ladies-in-waiting avoided her gaze. Even they had been chosen by Cromwell, their presence a performance of mercy laced with surveillance. Anne understood. She always had. The court was not a family. It was a mouth, and it needed meat. The more royal the blood, the more sacred the feast. Outside, the scaffolds were cleaned with salt. The block was tested with wet cloth. The axe was honed, and within the tower walls, her name began to echo not in reverence, but in ritual. A queen was becoming a curse. She was summoned to trial in a hall that had once knelt to her presence. Now, it rose only to condemn. The nobles sat in judgment like gargoyles on a crumbling cathedral, their eyes heavy with duty, their mouths dry with complicity. The charges were read as though rehearsed in some darker chamber. Anne listened, not for truth, but for intention. She could hear the design beneath the syllables, the careful arrangement of narrative dressed in accusation. They spoke of her lovers, of midnight meetings, of sorcery and seduction. Her womb, her wit, her very breath was made monstrous. A woman too clever, too barren, too beloved by the king she had become too much. She answered with clarity. Not to be believed, but to be remembered. Her voice was firm, not defiant. Her face, pale but dry. She did not plead. She did not bargain, because there was no bargain in a theater already burning. The sentence was known before the robes were worn. Death by fire was whispered but abandoned, too cruel, too revealing. They would give her the sword instead, brought from France, as if foreign steel could cleanse an English conscience. It was a kindness wrapped in spectacle, for there was no kindness in intention. Meanwhile, her alleged accomplices were dragged through the streets, their limbs shaking with disbelief, their families cloaked in dread. They ascended the scaffold with prayers bitten off between breaths. George Boleyn died last, his gaze never straying from the tower window where Anne waited. It is said he smiled. It is said he spoke verses as the axe fell. The crowd wept, but the king dined. Henry, once the fire that devoured the world for Anne's touch, now refused to say her name. He had turned toward Jane Seymour with a softness too pale to last. Jane, the absence of flame, the sanctuary of silence. He visited her rooms as Anne's blood was measured. He chose tapestries as George's head rolled. He spoke of peace, of renewal, while the Queen's body was being readied for execution. To love a king was to be devoured by one. Anne had seduced a man and unearthed a monster, and now the monster had grown tired. The fire he once stoked for her had become smoke, choking and directionless. He wanted legacy, not legend. He wanted obedience, not remembrance. So Anne had to die, not as a woman, but as a warning. Inside the tower, she was dressed not for death, but for farewell. She chose a gown of grey, unadorned but dignified. Her hair, once the envy of ladies, was gathered with trembling hands. She spoke gently to her maids, thanked them with a grace too sharp to forget. She walked to her final prayer, not with a queen's pride, but with a prophet's stillness. The morning she was to die. She laughed not from mirth, but from something older, a kind of surrender too ancient for despair. She joked with her jailers. She adjusted her veil. She whispered that she was ready, but no one ever is. The crowd gathered with damp anticipation. The sky did not weep. The scaffold stood alone, a stage without music. She climbed the steps as though ascending to some invisible throne. The executioner waited, dressed not in rage, but in ritual. A Frenchman, with a blade hidden to spare her fear. She thanked him. She forgave the king. Her words were measured, her posture unyielding. And then she knelt. The queen, who had once ruled a kingdom from the curl of her finger, now bowed to a block of wood. Her neck, pale as parchment, was bared to the wind. The crowd held its breath. The sword fell, and in the moment her body dropped. There was no cry, no gasp, only the sound of history twisting, of silence roaring, of 1,000 prayers scattering like ash. The blood pooled, red against the grain. The eyes that once bewitched a monarch stared skyward, glassy and still. The queen was dead. But the myth had begun. The queen's body was carried not on golden cloth, but on the cold spine of an arrow chest, hastily found, hurriedly cleaned, and wholly unworthy. No tomb waited, no herald sang, no final rites echoed in the vaulted heavens of Westminster. Only the wet silence of the Tower Chapel received her a place not made for queens, but for shadows. Her ladies, those who dared remain, wept not for what had been taken, but for what had been denied the dignity of departure, the softness of mourning, the human shape of grief. They placed her remains into earth as one might bury a mirror that had seen too much. No inscription, no crown, just soil and breath and the hush that follows horror. England turned its face. The king wore white. Jane Seymour smiled from beneath her veil, her silence blooming like frost over Anne's still burning name. Yet Anne had not vanished. She had multiplied, not in body, but in myth, not in voice, but in echo. Her blood had seeped into the flagstones, and those stones remembered. The tower remembered. The walls, once deaf to please, now whispered her name when no one watched. It was not a haunting, it was a reckoning. Anne Boleyn had died, but she had not been erased. Her absence became form, her silence became sound, and her child, red-haired, sharp-eyed, unbending, was watching. Elizabeth was not yet 3 when her mother died, too young to understand the machinery of betrayal, but old enough to sense the cold. She was declared illegitimate, stripped of her title, hidden in the folds of history like a wound no one dared treat. Yet even as she grew among strangers, the flame of her mother's name flickered beneath the surface. They whispered that she laughed like Anne, that her gaze had the same iron laced through silk, that her spine so still, so straight had never bent, even when her cradle did. In court, men who had watched Anne fall now bowed before the girl she left behind. In letters and portraits, Elizabeth began to reshape the shadow cast across her blood, not by denial, but by defiance. She studied not only statecraft, but silence. She learned how to rule with absence, how to endure with distance. The child of a disgraced queen, raised in exile, returned in fire, and when she took the throne, the wind changed. The air smelled not of incense, but of reckoning. Anne's blood had returned, not as victim, but as sovereign. And still, within the tower, the wound pulsed. The place of execution remained, the scaffold replaced but never forgotten. Each year, the birds circled as if called. The stones darkened with dew that smelled faintly of iron. Tourists would one day tread those grounds, unaware of the breath they disturbed. But for those who listen closely, there is a moment between the tolling of the bells and the hush of evening where the air tightens, where a footstep lingers too long, where a sigh is heard but never found. The ghost that walks there does not wail. She watches. Anne's haunting is not of screams, but of silence returned. She is not chained to vengeance. She is chained to remembrance. And that is far heavier. The king, for all his power, found no peace in her absence. Henry married again and again, chasing shadows of the fire he once tried to extinguish. But none burned as Anne had. Jane Seymour gave him the son he had once slaughtered a kingdom for, and then died before the boy could speak. The irony hung like smoke. The only wife he called beloved was the one who left him empty, as years dragged his body into decay. Henry grew swollen, limping through halls that still bore Anne's footsteps beneath the rushes. Her portraits had been burned, but her shape lingered in the corners. His courtiers dared not speak her name, but he heard it in every silence. Her ghost grew with his guilt. Each ache in his rotting leg a memory returned. No relic could ease it. No bride could silence it. The woman he had loved beyond salvation had become the weight on his crown. He died bloated, broken, and alone, his final prayer unspoken, his greatest fear unanswered. Not of God, but of being forgotten. But Anne was not forgotten. In every woman who dared to speak before being spoken to, she stirred. In every daughter crowned where sons had failed, she lived. In every sentence carved in wit instead of weapon, she whispered. History, written by victors, could not contain her. It called her whore, witch, traitor, reduced her to womb and rumor, but the ink trembled, the parchment warped. For Anne Boleyn had been none of those things, and all of them. She had worn her sins like armor and her intellect like daggers. She had danced where angels feared to walk, and for that they cut her down. But even in cutting, they could not silence her. Her head may have fallen, but her story rose, piece by piece, retold in tapestry and tongue, until the fiction bent under its own weight and the truth, slippery and bleeding, began to surface. She was the queen who never ruled but reigned in aftermath, the woman who defied a king and gave birth to one greater. Anne's tragedy was not her death, it was the fear she inspired. For what frightened them was not her body, but her mind, not her ambition, but her refusal to conceal it, not her beauty, but the fact that she demanded to be seen beyond it. And when they silenced her, they revealed themselves. History's cruelty lay not in her execution, but in the silence that followed. The silence that suggested she deserved it. The silence that echoed for centuries until the stones themselves began to speak. There is no grave that can hold a woman who dies unfinished. Anne's resting place bears no statue, no marble lie, no weeping angel to guard her name, only a faded plaque, walked over by the curious and the indifferent. Yet beneath that earth lies more than a body, lies a question, a pulse, a challenge. The line between sin and sainthood does not cut clean, and Anne Boleyn stood precisely in that fracture. She prayed before death, not to be saved, but to be understood. And still, the world argues over what she was, heroine or harlot, martyr or manipulator. But she does not answer. Her ghost, if it walks, does so with eyes open and mouth closed. She leaves the verdict unfinished. She leaves the wound open, because Anne Boleyn's legacy is not in the titles they stripped or the lies they told. It is in the daughter who wore a crown heavier than any man could lift, and in the silence that still resists the sword. The tower no longer bleeds, but it remembers. Beneath the gray sky and the wind-stained walls, something lingers, not a scream, not a ghost, but a question that never found its answer. Anne Boleyn walked those stones without a crown, and left behind a silence that breathes heavier than thunder. Her grave is nameless to most, but history bends around it like trees around a scar in the earth. Those who come searching for justice find only echoes. Those who come in reverence find a void. For Anne's legacy is not etched in marble or cloaked in sainthood. It moves like breath through broken windows. It waits where fire was once extinguished. She died with her eyes open. She died without flinching. She died carrying a name that would one day carve its initials into the bones of an empire. But the sword did not end her. It revealed her. It made visible the fear that men hide in laws, in rituals, in trials designed not to seek truth but to drown it. And so she remains not in flesh, but in fracture, not in monument, but in memory. They silenced her voice, but not her meaning. And now, in the stillness between history's pages, she listens, she watches, she waits. For there will always be a king who believes himself invincible, There will always be a woman who knows otherwise, and there will always be a silence sharp enough to cut through both. That silence is hers forever.